So, drawing on ideas discussed in that 2024 article, to what extent could a Eurobomb alleviate the pressures that are on the US, given NATO's reliance on shared nuclear responsibilities? Or do you think it would introduce new coordination challenges that might fragment the alliance cohesion or the cohesion of the alliance given its current context?
I mean, when you pose that as neither or, I mean, either could be true.
Yeah.
A new Eurobomb, on the one hand, could alleviate pressure on the United States in terms of choosing a theater in a conflict,
Yes.
but it also could fragment Allied cohesion. It really depends on the spirit in with which Europeans approach this problem, the context that within which it exists, the attitude. I mean, I hate to say
Yeah.
it, but vibes matter here. Um, this is why whenever I talk about new concepts in how Europe can contribute to the NATO deterrent, um, like a European option, for instance, the thing that I really think could happen based on the Lancaster Treaty and the Lancaster II statement made back by France and the UK in July is that they could work together, for instance. So France is updating its nuclear deterrent, both its sub-launch ballistic missile and its air-launched cruise missile.
Mm.
The UK is updating its sub-launch ballistic missile and its warhead. They could work together. They're both nuclear weapon states under the NPT treaty. There's no reason why they can't work together. It's not a proliferation concern. It's not like they're creating a new nuclear
Yeah.
state. So, I mean, first I want to say, like, the issues with the United States and nuclear deterrence go back a long way. For instance, at the very birth of the bomb in the Manhattan Project, it was in large part a UK idea with Einstein and the letter to Roosevelt and all the early scientific work and the fact that the UK became a haven for people who were fleeing the Nazis, including scientists. So they worked together on the bomb. But then in 1946, after Roosevelt had died and President Truman took over, you have this strain of Fortress America. And so they say, well, let's get the UK out of the nuclear program. And that's why the UK developed the bomb in the
Yeah.
first place. This strand goes all the way through to Nixon. President Nixon actually talked about withdrawing from Europe entirely because he was mad that the Europeans weren't contributing to the Vietnam War, among other economic pressures, etc. Um, and it's funny, I'll actually send you a cartoon from Le Canal Échelonné, a famous French political satirical magazine of France trying to replace the US as the nuclear guarantor of Europe. You go back to Macron early in his campaign, his premiership. He was talking about, oh, there'll be a European deterrent, and he didn't sound like he was saying there should be a European pillar. It sounded like he was trying to push the US away. This strain that goes back to de Gaulleism that hooks up with this American firstism. So there's a way you could do this the right way, which would be the UK and France working together, not to replace the US, but kind of what the UK would call a belt and braces approach. Backing up the US by doing something else included. So, for instance, instead of being wholly dependent on the US for sub-launch ballistic missiles, the UK could develop a joint missile with France. They already have cooperation on the conventional side on missile development. Why not on the nuclear? And then an air-launched cruise missile. Now, France believes a nuclear-armed air-launched cruise missile is a strategic deterrent. But in the Cold War, that wasn't always the case. Alcom's air-launched cruise missiles with a nuclear option were also seen as a theater weapon. So the UK and France could develop jointly what the French are calling AS-4NG, I think it is, which is the replacement for their air-launched cruise missile that's going to be stealthier and faster. They could develop it jointly. They could develop the warhead jointly. They could not rely on the US for special material like tritium to boost the bomb. They could rely on France. They could work together. And the UK could then offer that missile to allies as a DCA, a dual capable aircraft mission for theater strikes, a deep strike option for NATO. And again, not to replace the B-61, but as a supplement
Yeah.
and building on those allies that participate in the dual capable aircraft mission, make sure that that air-launched cruise missile is compatible with all fourth and fifth generation NATO aircraft. That way, you would have the UK supporting the Allies. There's an issue with money, for instance, with the UK and with France with developing a new warhead and a new system. France is already doing it, so the investment will be there. The UK could participate. And there's this other thing that happened in 1964 called the Multilateral Nuclear Force Initiative by the United States, which was, it's a long story, I won't go into it. The UK hated the idea. So the UK proposed what they called the Atlantic Nuclear Force, which would be allies paying the UK to support their, at that time, Vulcan bomber and other systems. The UK, in other words, already has a tradition of asking allies to support its own nuclear deterrent. So you could see allies that want a new NATO nuclear capability could pay the UK so that the UK could expand the atomic weapon enterprise to build a new warhead for an air-launched cruise missile jointly developed with France that then the UK could offer to allies at existing dual-capable aircraft bases. So again, you have a belt and braces approach. And why is this a good idea? It's because the US has always said, Commander European Command, the US EUCOM commander, is also Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And he has, we don't know exactly how many, about 100, maybe more B-61s assigned to him at a bunch of bases. But if the US is in a protracted conflict, for instance, with China over Taiwan, those very B-61s may be moved and used in the Asian context. So America firsters, people who aren't enamored with American extended deterrence guarantees or who are maybe more focused on China, will say, well, you see, the allies are tying us down in Europe. If we said, well, no, if you need to use it in Asia, that's fine. We have this alternative deterrent which can support the US, so the US doesn't have to choose. The US could, yeah, you want to move them all and use them in a different scenario, that's fine. We have a supplement to US deterrence. So you see how, if you pose it the right way, it sounds great. On the other hand, if France says, we're doing this because we can't rely on the Americans, well, that sounds horrible. And again, that'll feed into the America firsters who are like, see, those Europeans, they hate us. There's a way to pose it just in terms of atmosphere that could, A, not hurt the NPT, B, not offend the Americans, and C, provide real assurance for allies that there is going to be a nuclear deterrent no matter what, and D, provide an additional option other than an airdropped American nuclear bomb, which has always been kind of a tricky proposition, by providing instead a standoff cruise missile, which I think would be a better deterrent to Russia. I think Russia would see that as more of a credible deterrent than an F-35 penetrating Russian airspace and dropping a B-61 over a target.
Okay, so it's really important about the kind of the communication that's used in this kind of hypothetical project. And you're kind of talking about the building blocks already being there, but it's about connecting them in the right way that Americans kind of feel is a, as you say, the vibes, are positive. And it's kind of, it sometimes strikes me as some sort of breakup that you've got to manage really carefully, haven't you? And you've got to say the right thing rather than just going all off on your own and getting really kind of confrontational, or that kind of feeling.
Exactly. We're not getting separate bank accounts because I'm leaving you. It's just because it's better to manage our
Yeah.
finances.
And I mean, you kind of touched on what I was going to talk about in the second question, is that, you talked about how increased allied contributions to the nuclear deterrence in the NATO context in your article could signal resolve and reduce the risk of Russian miscalculation. And so what extent do you feel that kind of a European deterrence, I mean, you touched on it a bit, would signal kind of credibility and enhance the kind of resolve that's being pushed towards Russia?
So there's uh, a great thought leader in nuclear issues named Brad Roberts. And I remember he told me once, we were talking about different deterrence options and what the future looks like. And he said, Russia would not be convinced of European resolve by them only doing the easy things. Europe, the Russians and Putin himself would be more deterred if the Europeans did the hardest things. And, a new European nuclear option to supplement the NATO option would be one of the hardest things you could do. Now, back in the Cold War, the UK developed its own warheads, the WE-1877, 187. That they had their own airdrop bomb. They were developing their own air-launched cruise missile. They're doing all kinds of stuff. The French, obviously, also short range artillery, everything. They started sharing with the United States, but then developed their own. The UK developed its own, but then started sharing with the US. So it's not unprecedented, but it would be such a huge signal. And I've always said that NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, even the B-61, which again, an airdrop bomb doesn't seem like the most credible deterrent possible, but the very fact that it exists forces the Europeans to think about, and it forces the Americans to allow Europe to have a voice in nuclear planning. If there was no nuclear sharing, the Europeans would just be shut out. That whole muscle memory of Europeans working together with the Americans on nuclear targeting and thinking about what nuclear use looks like would disappear, which I think would be a terrible thing. Like, you want the Europeans to actually be involved so that they think about it. And I think that makes the Russians really think twice, because if you went back to 2005, for instance, the Netherlands or Belgium or Italy might say, oh, I would never use nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are a vestige of the past, like whatever. By now, European voices saying, no, nuclear deterrence actually matters. And being able to credibly tell the Russians that any attack might involve nuclear weapons, that's important. It's not just some abstract concept. It's a real concept, because I think Putin thinks about nuclear coercion all the time. I think he thinks if he could threaten the Europeans out of anything, out of defending themselves, out of trade, out of human rights, out of anything, he would use nuclear weapons to threaten them out of it. He tried to threaten them out of missile defense. He tried to threaten them out of NATO enlargement. He's tried to use nuclear threats in Ukraine over and over and over again. And it doesn't work. And the more he does it, the more Europeans are like, oh, this is important. And this kind of European understanding of the value of nuclear deterrence, I don't think Putin really thought that the Europeans would go all in after Crimea, after 2022. I think he's been shocked by the resolve that they've shown. And so I think that helps, that resolve really helps, that the European voices, and I mean, I hate to say it because I don't want to see another ally develop its own nuclear weapons, but the fact that that debate broke out in Germany in 2022, I mean, my God, I never myself, someone who worked at NATO in 2012 to 2020, when I showed up at NATO in 2012, the idea that the Germans would be talking about developing their own nuclear weapons, that Poland would be talking about developing nuclear weapons, that Turkey would say, well, others have them, why not us? I didn't see that coming. And again, I don't want them to. And I think that's why NATO nuclear sharing is really important, because it acts as a curb on that appetite. But even that must have sent a shockwave through Moscow to say, oh my God, like, we thought we could break NATO unity. We thought we could break the reliance on nuclear weapons. We thought we could terrify them out of this. And instead, they're like, well, you keep threatening us, and maybe we need them too. So, you know, as you said, given that European resolve and European voices signal deterrence, I think that's very, very important. But as an American and as a transatlanticist and as someone who really loves NATO, I don't want to see any other country develop nuclear weapons, and especially not a European. I want to see enhanced options to provide Europeans with ideas, concepts, and capabilities that make them say, oh, okay, well, we don't need a new bomb. The UK is helping us. France is helping us. The US is helping us. That's enough. We need them to work more closely with us and find more ways for us to work with them. But we don't need to fundamentally change the global nonproliferation architecture in order to help us to prevent Russia from attacking us.
Yeah, and I mean that collaboration, as you say, can kind of avoid introducing new nuclear entities into the world. And I think we all would like it to stay at the number that it already is. I think it's more than enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
So looking at the kind of specifically the European context, I know you're based in Germany. What political, legal, or institutional obstacles do you see as being the most significant to the creation of a shared nuclear European nuclear deterrent, or that collaboration, as you talked about before?
There's no legal limit to that type of cooperation.
Yeah.
I've written extensively and studied extensively the origins of the NPT Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. And I did a paper back in 2017 studying the nexus between those two things. And since then, I've done even more research and worked with the US. They declassified another 960 documents on this topic. I still haven't gone through them all. About 150 of them out of the
We
900
won't hold that
ones.
against you.
Um, but what you really find is that politically and legally, the U.S. knew that there was a secret program. It's called FIG, and it was France, Italy, and West Germany had a public agreement to share nuclear power technology and a secret protocol on nuclear weapons. And the US was furious. I mean, Sweden had a nuclear weapons program. Switzerland had a nuclear weapons program. South Korea, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, all these countries were going for nuclear weapons. And the US was like, how do we stop this? And so the NPT treaty was the treaty angle, nuclear sharing and extended deterrence was the military angle, and then there was pressure, economics, and all the kind of stuff that the US put on countries. But legally, nuclear sharing is designed, and extended deterrence is designed to prevent proliferation. So there's no legal reason why you can't develop new options as long as they don't, as we just mentioned in the
Yeah.
previous question, create new nuclear powers. Even in the NPT, if you look at the part of the US effort was the Europeans pushed back and said, well, what if the EU becomes a super country like the United States of Europe?
Yeah.
The national countries disappear. Can that have nuclear weapons? And the US and the Soviets agreed it can, but only if you don't have France and the EU with a nuclear weapon. You have to there's either a France or a nuclear armed EU. You can't have both. You would have to have them subsume into a state. France could then give its nuclear deterrent as part of a bigger state. But you know what I mean? It was always very much focused, the US efforts and the Soviet efforts in negotiating the NPT was to prevent there from being more nuclear states. But nuclear sharing, it's fine. And UK and French cooperation, again, completely allowed by the NPT, they're nuclear weapon states. Them working together doesn't create proliferation. So legally and even politically, there's no barrier. The issue is more psychological on the European states. Do they want to? And again, this goes back to the first question. If France is doing this to undermine American support for Europe and American, what's seen as within France as the Anglo-Saxon axis dominating European discussions, obviously that's that tension between French leadership of Europe and what they see as, this outside Anglo-Saxon influence. That tension has been there forever. But I do think Macron, over the past few years, has gone further to say, no, it's not a replacement. It's a supplement. Let's work together. And you see French nuclear exercises coming closer to NATO nuclear exercises. You see France recently, this year, for instance, they have a series of exercises that occur throughout the year. One of their exercises that was right next to their nuclear exercise included, what was it, Sweden, Croatia, Poland, working together with France on what looked like conventional support for nuclear operations. Unprecedented, the idea that France is cooperating not through NATO, but bilaterally with NATO allies to support French nuclear operations in an exercise that came right up against Steadfast Noon, the NATO nuclear exercise. This shows that France is trying to think more creatively and credibly about how to support the NATO deterrent. And I think that's wonderful. And if it's in that spirit, then there's no barrier. And I do think, like I mentioned before, you go back 20 years, 15 years, there were a lot of NATO allies who just thought, oh, we're over nuclear weapons. It's, this is a thing of the past. Even Angela Merkel was going to allow Germany to age out of its nuclear deterrent by not making a decision on tornado replacement. And it really was the Zeitenwende and the shock of February 2022 that made Germany say, no, we need to be in this. We're going to buy F-35As. The UK itself buying F-35As. I think psychologically they've gotten over the idea that nuclear weapons are just going to disappear as a vestige of the Cold War and now understand they need to be in it. So politically, militarily, psychologically, I see the barriers disappearing in terms of Europe coming up with new ideas. Again, the context matters, how they pose that matter. And especially for the Eastern Europeans, they don't want to see the Americans pushed out. I think that message has come through clear to France. And now I really see the Lancaster Treaty and the Doncaster Statement this year and the Security and Defense Review of the UK and French moves as being, okay, we're not trying to replace the Americans, but let's embrace this approach. So I do see all those barriers kind of disappearing. And as long as there's no actual proliferation, as long as there's no nuclear weapon states, I do think new options are a great thing, and we'll see continued progress. And again, I don't think all of this is a good thing in and of itself,
Mm.
but as countries like Russia, countries like China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, like this global nuclear arms race is happening, and the West has really sort of neglected their thinking about this. And so, if we're going to credibly deter Russia and China in the future from thinking that they can invade Taiwan or the Baltic states or any NATO territory, we have to be able to show them that the price they might pay might be the ultimate price, nuclear weapons. And so, as terrible as that is, I do see Europe entering back into educating themselves about nuclear deterrence. It's one of the reasons I'm in Europe. One of the reasons I'm in the Pacific Forum is to bring together Asian and European audiences to think about extended deterrence as a way to increase their security, to try to suppress the appetite for proliferation and increase the appetite for thinking about these things, thinking about new options. And yeah, hopefully we can get to a place where Russia and China are deterred, where India and Pakistan are not at war, where North Korea is less menacing to South Korea, without new nuclear weapon states, in a stable situation where we can then have talks and try to find cohabitation, coexistence somehow. But disarmament, unfortunately, for now is not the way. And I don't think proliferation is the way. I think there's a middle ground where extended deterrence and NATO and allied cooperation on these issues can prevent war and increase security and stability so that you can have the kind of discussions that we need to have to try to foster a longer term peace.
And that, I mean, that's really interesting. But drawing specifically on your talk about collaboration, what kind of command and control structure would you see in Europe as being acceptable to all of the member states? Or, would it be England and France led, or would it be more of a coalition of many of the states?
Well, so at NATO, what you have is a committee called the Nuclear Planning Group. It's where the big political decisions are made by the alliance, by all allies that want to participate on how to do nuclear planning, nuclear thought, all that kind of stuff. Then there's the high level group of the Nuclear Planning Group, which is chaired by the United States, because the bulk of nuclear weapons assigned to the defense of NATO, not just the B-61s, but the US strategic deterrent. And typically, the Supreme Allied Commander has always been American because of that nuclear
Mhm.
decision. And the deputy has, by tradition, been UK because of the UK subfleet, which is also in war tasked to NATO and SACEUR for coordinated strikes once the decision by the UK Prime Minister has been made. And then France does its own thing. So I don't think you need a new structure for command and control. I think the NATO structure works. If, heaven help us, the US diminishes that support or gives away the SACEUR position, you would need the UK or France to be in that position. I mean, it'd be awesome if it was France, because then they would have to coordinate with NATO, which would be cool. But it'd probably be the UK. It would have to be the UK if the US was not in that leadership position, because the decision on nuclear use would have to be a nuclear state. It couldn't be a non-nuclear
Yeah.
state. But you don't need a different structure. There are command and control systems in place. There's a special NC3I nuclear command control communication system, an intelligence system in place. So you don't need to create a new system. It would just be a new delivery option that would fit into that system. Just like at the height of the Cold War, the NATO had nuclear landmines, nuclear artillery, nuclear rockets, nuclear missiles, um, nuclear anti-aircraft missiles. We had all these things, all under a joint command and control system. So again, I don't think you need any kind of new arrangement. It would just be, how would Europeans supplement or even command that arrangement in the absence of or with a diminished participation by the United States? I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel. It exists. It's being modernized consistently.
Mm.
So you would just turnkey that over. I hope not. I hope the U.S. would continue its role. But, again, if the U.S. Decides to diminish its role, the system's there. It's just
Yeah.
somebody has to run it. That's all.
Yeah, the structures are already in place. It just is who the actors are. And then our final question, kind of veering slightly off, is, Europe's often seen, and European countries especially are seen as kind of a peace promoting power in the international sector, and some of them do a lot of work on global non-nuclear proliferation. Do you think that putting a European nuclear deterrent under that umbrella would affect that kind of the way that they're seen, or is it France and England already have those capabilities, so it wouldn't affect or change how they're perceived in the international state?
I think that's why I'm specifically so strongly
Yeah,
advocating any option would only involve bolstering UK and French contributions to NATO deterrence. I think if you saw proliferation, I mean, I saw a paper, my God, in was it Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, one of the big international relations magazines earlier this week published a piece by some people who suggested that Germany, Canada, and Japan should develop nuclear weapons because that would be stabilizing. And I just thought, what kind of moron thinks that's a great idea? I mean, first of all, Canada, the Canadian Foreign Ministry, Global Canada, has been such a supporter of nuclear nonproliferation. Now, to be fair, Canada used to be part of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. NORAD, the
yeah,
North American Air Defense System, actually included nuclear armed anti aircraft missiles based in Canada. And the reason we know that is because the Canadian Parliament debated it in public before they accepted the US offer. And Canadian forces in Europe were prepared to use US nuclear weapons as part of the NATO deterrent. Um, but part of the reason they did that is because they also did not want to see additional NATO allies or adversaries armed with nuclear weapons. And they thought that joining the extended deterrence of NATO and bilaterally with the US was a good way of preventing the appetite of other countries from developing nuclear weapons. Canada's position has maintained consistently through the decades the idea that suddenly they would develop nuclear weapons, meaning they would have to withdraw from the NPT treaty, meaning they would have to abjure peaceful cooperation on nuclear energy. It's just baffling, just baffling. How is that a better world? Germany as well. When we see these debates in Germany, even I get nervous. Like, no, Germany doesn't need nuclear weapons,
yeah,
please. And Japan. I mean, my God, if Japan developed nuclear weapons, what would South Korea do? What would Taiwan do? What would China do? Good Lord, weird. So, those European allies who have always been a strong voice for non-proliferation can credibly say that they are part of an arrangement that actually has prevented and stopped other countries from seeking nuclear weapons. If you go back a few years ago, the Swiss government released a report on the TPNW, on the nuclear ban treaty, where they said we should not join because we actually think that NATO's nuclear deterrent, NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements provide security for Switzerland, which was
yeah,
just a jaw-dropping statement, but true. Even neutral, non-aligned states understand that NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement actually has helped to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. No country ever sought nuclear weapons because NATO has nuclear sharing. No country withdrew from the NPT treaty or refused to sign it because of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. And in fact, as I mentioned, countries have forsworn nuclear weapons because of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. So I think Europeans can continue to advocate for the elimination of nuclear weapons while at the same time relying on the United States, as long as nuclear weapons exist, to say that this is better than the spread. And under these conditions, we can try to get to talks that will solve the underlying problems that cause nations to seek their own nuclear weapons. So I don't see a contradiction between Europe continuing to advocate for the elimination of nuclear weapons, while at the same time saying that US extended deterrence is a far better option than having 20, 25, or 30 nuclear armed
yeah.
states on Earth. Yeah, I don't see a contradiction. I think Europeans can still be leading voices on nuclear nonproliferation and even towards a world free of nuclear weapons um, under these conditions, understanding everything else that I've said. I see no contradiction in that. And I hope they continue to reinforce the global nonproliferation system, the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and shout out to Director General Rafael Grossi for doing an astonishing job during his term as IAEA DG. to bolster safeguards and to try to prevent the spread. It's just one of the most important missions I think anyone in international relations can dedicate themselves towards. And so, I welcome your work in this conversation today as part of trying to raise people's understanding and awareness of how important nuclear nonproliferation is.